happy to welcome you to this presentation on, we coined it planetary health. It's a new term arriving in medicine, and how this affects our community of burners. We have three people in this group who would be contributing. Frog, I haven't seen him yet. Maybe he also had the wrong link, but maybe he will share in a minute. He's a green architect. For 5 decades, he has been practicing sustainability efforts in this kind of architecture realm, and created these frameworks around sustainability, actually. And in his camp community, the Green Theme Camp, they are developing a model to drive this or bring this to the playa. And I met him on the Hive last year. And I was just saying, hey, Frog, I have an event in Germany. Maybe you want to proof of concept some of these concepts. And then that's when our collaboration started. And so now we're 1 year after the event, already planning the next one. And that's the side I want to share with you. So what we will bring in this presentation is, there are, for us, 6 green priorities in terms of event sustainability, and we will share these categories with you. And how do we align these priorities with other global green initiatives? Because there are several. And Frog, as he's from the architectural space, I will not go into detail on these ones, but they are the groundwork for what we will be presenting today, by the example of New Zealand. And that's Andy, who's chair from the Kiwiburn, and me from Germany, from an event that's not a burn, but we're also making sustainability efforts, and we try to share what we came up with. And hopefully we can inspire you to, your event, your camp, to become more sustainable. So in terms of event sustainability, these are the dimensions we'll be looking at, and they will grow over time, that's for sure. So probably even more dimensions will come, but I think let's not be too ambitious and focus on these ones, because they're already very important, and many events or camps don't address them yet. So what are we looking at? Emissions, mainly CO2, but also other emissions. Power, so where do we take our power from? And they all have their connectivity. So you have a generator that produces the energy. It will also create emissions. Then shelter. How do we build and sleep in the shelters? How do we use water? What food do we eat at the events? How do we deal with waste? And how does this impact the communities around the event? So on top of all of that comes awareness, and I will make this very clear that this is an important part. It is also what we try to raise in this presentation, even though I don't know what's your current level. So some of this might be new to you, maybe other aspects are familiar. And we hope to build a community of green burners where we can connect and share ideas and exchange ideas and learnings to all become more efficient in this kind of dimension of sustainability. So these are the global green initiatives that Frog was from his background in architecture. So you can see that there's a long journey, and he has been doing that for 20 years. And what is interesting is that there's a great overlap to event sustainability. So exactly these dimensions that we're looking at. And that's actually perfect, because if we get inspired to do tackle these dimensions at the burn, it will become way more accessible to also tackle them in our default lives. So Frog is from the Green Theme Camp, and the acronym GTCC, and they want to help burners to become more sustainable, CO2 negative, and this year on the playa, prototyping one of their certification programs to give burners a framework to become sustainable, and to also benchmark themselves in this community. And these are the focus areas who are exactly in overlap with what we're looking at. And the interesting part is like we want to accelerate this kind of change. And when I approached Frog last year and suggested, hey, do you want to maybe proof of concept something at our event? That's exactly what the community needs. So some kind of people that are early movers that are ready to do this. And when the Burning Man in Nevada couldn't take place, we were helping to kind of like give space of like action to kind of prototype all of these dimensions. So first learning, and these slides will become familiar to you. We made them green as like the most essential takeaways from our presentation. Multipliers play a crucial role. So you need some green leads in your kind of regional burns and your camp, somebody that takes on the leading role or a multiplying role. And if you have a big team tackling different dimensions, then that's even better. And if these camps or the regional networks in terms of sustainability can connect, that's even better. And another learning that you will see is that regional events and camps have their own characteristics and therefore need their adapted frameworks. So there is no one size fits all. So if we're talking about a green, let's say, meadow somewhere in New Zealand compared to the desert of Nevada, you can already anticipate that it will require different characteristics to tackle sustainability efforts. So now we're coming to the introduction of us two of our speakers. So Andy, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Nils. So I'm Andy, so I'm the chair and the treasurer of Kiwiburn. So we are one of the oldest regional events outside of the United States. I'm also the facilitator for Kiwiburn sustainability team, which is known as the Green Kiwis. And we have a philosophy of growing green. So starting with the individual, moving up through the camps, through the event, to the community, to the country, and then going global. And one of our key things is making sustainability fun and rewarding. So some of you may have heard of Kiwiburn, some of you may not, but we're a 6-day festival that's held in January of each year. And we started out with as you can see, we're a long, long way from the United States. So we're down here in New Zealand, and then within New Zealand, we're in the middle of the North Island. As we zoom in here, you'll see that we're actually very remote, but we're very fortunate that we're sitting alongside a river. We've got a forest, and during the day, just wait for it to catch up. So this is what it looks like once we have our participants arriving on the site. So in the top of the screen there, you can see we've got a river going through, we've got a forest area, and then we've got lots of green meadows. So we're a totally different environment to obviously the Burning Man event. And therefore we had to adjust some of our criteria or our sustainability groups accordingly. But obviously one of the things we do during the day is we repurpose wood into delightful art pieces. And then come nightfall, we decide that we're going to burn them. So that's what our site looks like at night. One thing that does happen though is obviously, like most burns, we have to operate in a remote area. So X marks the spot in this case, but all of our major population centres are circled in yellow, and we're obviously a long, long way away from them. So transport becomes a key element of what we're facing. And to give you some context, New Zealand, if you placed it on your map for USA, that's how we'd stretch across there. So we're effectively the size of Oregon State, but we've only got 5 million people, and we're spread out across that entire country. So passing over to Nils now.
So I'm a medical doctor in the default word, and head of planetary health at a digital health company. So I'm really invested in the field of planetary health and understanding the impacts on our health that result from destroying of our ecosystems. At the same time, for 10 years, I'm an organizer of MediMeisterschaften Festival, which is the biggest medical doctor and student gathering, I think, in the world, and biggest amateur soccer tournament in Europe. We hosted 25,000 people in 2019. This last year, it was 10,000 due to COVID restrictions, and it will be again 25,000 people. We have existed for 20 years. It's a 3-day event. And the big characteristic is that 90% of the participants have a medical background. And that also gives us a special responsibility. And for me, as our slogan is Nur Liebe, which can be translated as like only love, we always have this kind of prefix. And the initiative that we founded last year also in collaboration with people from Burning Man is Nur Future, this kind of sustainability efforts. And to give you a quick understanding of what this is about, let's look at the kind of video of like after movie of last year. So the average age is 23 years. Most of the stuff we build is self-made. It's 72 universities from all over Europe. And for the medical students that usually are heavily studying and have a very dry kind of student routine life with a lot of pressure on their shoulders, this event and the 3 months before are an opportunity to collaborate and to experience like a very different kind of environment. And it's actually a very inspiring place to share sustainability ideas, because we hope to be multipliers. We hope to make the future doctors multipliers in society. And as 1 in 5 medical students in Germany visit this event, that's a huge opportunity. So that's why we take our future sustainability efforts very serious and at the same time very playful. So in terms of event sustainability, we mentioned these dimensions, and the top dimension is awareness, which is above that all. And I'd like to start with awareness. So if we look at awareness, this slide will become familiar to you in a second. But just to understand the context, what does awareness mean in the context of a medical doctor event? You know, the field of planetary health is emerging, and it understands the connection between all the ecosystems and our health. And with Fridays for Future, with this like youth movement of demoing every Friday against the destroying of our ecosystems, there is this kind of community around Health for Future that mobilizes from all different kinds of universities in Europe and Germany to co-demo and put planetary health in the education agendas for medical studies, etc., etc. And in this context, the knowledge perspective about planetary health is very important. And since we ran out a bit of time, I would probably move this to the end, so we have a bit of time for the discussion. But just some flashlight impressions. What is planetary health? Why is it important? And the impact on health, to give you a feeling on how we try to touch this dimension of awareness at this event. So we have the individual health, right? That's how we used to look at health maybe 200, 300, or maybe thousands of years ago. The public health domain is very younger, and where we understand that how we work, how we live together, and like this kind of public access to, for example, clean drinking water has a huge effect on the individual health. So it became more important. Then global health understands the connection between different countries, climate zones, etc. And the biggest scale so far, and I don't think we will reach a lot beyond, because our kind of large can look at healthcare for now. That's my prediction, but it's a very important one. And what we understand is that the human body, it has all these different kinds of organs, and the planet does as well. It has different kinds of dimensions, 9 different kinds of dimensions, and the person that invented it from Sweden most likely hopefully we'll get a Nobel Prize for it, because it makes it really tangible where we cross boundaries. So it's called the planetary boundaries, and you can see the red areas where we are losing track. And one success story that I will not share today is ozone depletion, because we were already beyond the threshold. Then we reduced these gases from, for example, fridges, etc. We kind of sanctioned them with an agreement in Montreal. And now the ozone layer is again closing, and we can be protected from cancer, right? And the radiation. But the other dimensions, we are still very fastly moving towards tipping points that cannot be made, that we cannot return from. So why is planetary health important? So there is no planet B. I just said that our planet with this kind of characteristics is very unique, and we would need to light travel, but we haven't even identified other planets. So that's a very obvious one. We only have this spaceship, this Earth, with pictures with infrared light taken at night, where you can see the cities lit up. And I think in this age, we can say that it's a kind of like biotechnical spaceship, if we look at it from that perspective. So what are the boundaries? We talked about it, and let me quickly touch the most meaningful ones, or the most ignored ones. So starting with every day, we render 200 species extinct. Normally it would be 0.02. That's 10,000 times more than usually. And that's catastrophic, because with the destabilization of the bio ecosystems, we are, for example, looking into reduced yields and a lot of other problems. But I said high level, we could talk for hours about this topic alone. The correlation of CO2, or like CO2 equivalent gases, and the temperature is very clear. So every hour we release more than 100 years of captured CO2. And now every second we release 4 Hiroshima bombs of energy into our oceans. And if you imagine that in times of war, I think this is a war on nature that we've been having silently, and we should really try to become aware about and mitigate it and stop it. And this is, I think, enough for now. I will skip the rest of the slides. We talk about climate scenarios. We will likely end up 2.7. 2.7 with the current initiatives is way not enough. We need 20 years of COVID-19 pandemic to nail the Paris agreements, which would be 2 degrees. And we will not see coral reefs. We will probably not see alpine glaciers anymore. Greenland ice sheet, if it melts, it will be 7 meters. End of this year, like century, we will see 60 to 1.30 meter sea level increase. So I suggest you not buy any properties very much at the ocean side. Cities like Florida or Jakarta already moved. So this is news from Jakarta. They're planning to move to Borneo, a city with more than 10 million people, because they're drowning. All this is real. So it's unnegotiable real. And there are secondary health effects, but there are also primary health effects. I don't have the time. I'm sorry. Let's go through this in the discussion. If you're interested in that, also reach out. This is really my passion field. I can talk for hours about this, but I think it's enough for now to say we will have food crisis. We will have, this is food riots depending on food prices, even fueled by the war. So it's difficult times ahead with extreme weather conditions rising, air quality. 9 of 10 people breathe polluted air. It's worse than HIV and malaria together. And it's particles that we don't even measure where they come from. It's just the size. It can cross the blood barrier. And basically we're eating through our lungs pollutants from the industry and a lot of different sources that cause cancer, change our hormonal cycles, and are very toxic to the human body. So how can we raise awareness? And now we touch the part of the events. And this is where you can possibly come into play and be inspired or share in the discussion your ways to tackle these issues. So ways to raise awareness, for example, we have beehives, we are planting trees at our event. We're doing a lot of creative stuff. So we write songs about returnable bottles. we have models to come to the event with the bicycles, like Tour de France. I don't know if you know it, but they basically all came with a bicycle. We have charity runs, models that try to make public transport sexy, or even climate songs like this one. Actually, I'm a musician as well, as it's my biggest passion. And in front of this audience, we were able to perform a song about climate change and the life we are likely to anticipate in 2040. So is the dimension of creativity. And now the slide is familiar to you, the learnings in terms of awareness. So awareness is essential, and you can reach it through knowledge, actions, and creativity. And another thing I would like to highlight, if you start your green initiatives, make an inventory, because so many things that I mentioned now, I didn't do them, I just collected them. So in this community of our event, there are so many things already have happened, and it's really important to celebrate the early movers and the successes in every art form. So we have reached the second chapter. So we talked about awareness, and now we will do a run through these dimensions. And I would say we put this one at first because it's the most obvious and important one to tackle for now. So let's get right into it. Emissions. Handing over to Andy.
Okay, thank you very much. So just to give you a bit of background, so Kiwiburn's been around since 2004, and around 2008 they put a concerted effort into sustainability. And so one of the things they were looking at was what impact is our event having on the environment. And what they found, first of all, was that 95% of all the CO2 emissions were related to transport. So that's our participants coming onto the site and then leaving, and also all the vans and trucks bringing the theme camps and things like that. Sorry about that. I think that's our third participant telling me where he is. Sorry about that. So Kiwiburn 2020 comes along, and we say we're putting in an even bigger effort into it. So we resurrected our sustainability team, but we only managed to do that 6 weeks before the event. So what we decided was that we were going to concentrate on basically collecting data and basically getting a benchmark that we can work against going forward. And we were going to tackle 3 key areas: so transport, waste, and power generation. And so we set up a team, and they basically interviewed everybody who came on site. So every vehicle that came to the gate got interviewed. Basically, they got interrogated as far as where have you come from, how many people have you got, and things like that. And what we found was, in that case, in 2020, we had less than 2 people on average per vehicle. We generated 134 tons just from transportation. And the average journey for a vehicle was 677 kilometers. So that's there and back. So the next step then was to say, okay, what was our total mileage that we did? And we found we did 500,000 kilometers in those vehicles. And that would mean that we'd have to have over 2,000 trees planted and growing for 10 years just to offset our transport emissions from that event. So what they did at that stage was they had 4 subcommittees. So we set up one for energy, and that was looking at all sorts of things like alternative energy for MPW, which is the equivalent of Burning Man's DPW. We had a waste materials subcommittee. How can we reduce it? How can we do recycle or reuse things? And then obviously the big one was the transport one. And we were looking at what mass transit options could we have. So whether it's buses, railways, even people bicycling to the event. So we were looking at having express access to the gate. So anybody who came on a bike or anybody who came in a vehicle with more than a certain number of people in it, they'll get straight through. And then we had to look at theme camps and how that would work for them. Could they consolidate several theme camps in one geographic area? Could they fill up a container rather than sending 3 or 4 trucks? So those things were looked at. Then we had our regeneration subcommittee. They were looking at emissions. And so we had to admit that if we're going to have transport, we're going to have emissions, and what are we going to do about it? So obviously the first thing is to reduce and minimize them. But then we're going to get to a certain level that we can't do anything more about. And what are we going to do? Are we going to do tree planting? Are we going to buy carbon credits? Are we going to invest in projects that are doing carbon sequestering? And Kiwiburn had been planting trees, but planting trees is not a quick answer, and we're now faced with the fact that we do need a quick answer. So even though we've been planting trees, it's not going to have a result that we need. And what was a little bit disappointing was when we compared 2008 to 2020, we found our CO2 emissions had only dropped from 75 kilos per person down to 67. And our gut feel is that is really only as a result of basically economies of scale, because we have now over 2,000 in the population. So we don't think it's actually a direct measure of a reduction of transport movements. It's just the sheer volume of participants that we've got now compared to only 182 back in 2008. But we still were sitting at the same level, that we had 95% being the transport contribution, and we were still faced with the fact that we really had to make 50 to 80% reduction in emissions to be effective. One of the interesting things you can see here that came out of that investigation was that every time that we have somebody leave New Zealand and head over to Burning Man, they're actually contributing 100 times the emissions they do from attending Kiwiburn in New Zealand. So I guess one of the calls out we're making to regionals is make your burn awesome. Get people coming to you rather than the feeling that they have to travel across to Burning Man. But we do recognise that there will be the need to go to Burning Man, and several of us on the call are intending to go, but we have to offset that and we have to balance the books. And I'll pass over to Nils, and he can cover the same thing for his event.
Thank you, Andy. So this calculation is from last year when we were hosting the event with 10,000 people. And this is a picture from last year. And we basically divided the CO2 emissions in transportation of participants and operations. And that's already a unique feature, because when you certificate an event in terms of CO2 neutrality, most providers of these certificates only focus on operations. But you will learn in the course of this presentation that that's very short falling, and that's basically closing the eyes to the biggest emissions. So let's look into transportation of participants. How do you calculate this? We were developing the model, so you can see here, this is where the event is. This is Germany, and these are all the universities, places where people come from. So we said, how many participants do we have from where? How many kilometers did each participant travel? How many participants did we have per car? And then the CO2 per kilometers. What you see here is a pity. It makes me a bit sad, but due to COVID-19, we were not allowed to have shared buses. And this is a reason why we had more emissions this year than in the last years, because we were already kind of strong on this dimension. But COVID, in terms of this kind of isolation rules or quarantinization rules, if you are considered a contact person, the risk was too high this year. But one of the efforts of No Future will be this year to tackle exactly this dimension, to come back to a high degree of bus use. And I think this picture tells the whole story. This is 70 people in cars versus buses. And the CO2 footprint is for a car travel, 50 kilos per person and 18 per bus. And that's about our event. Now, if you look at Burning Man, where people fly in, this might be very much higher. We might talk about hundreds of kilos. And if you think in ratio to the weight of the person, I think it's far away from efficiency. So one of the big learnings and takeaway, if you can enhance this in your events, ride sharing and bus transport is very, very effective. It can reduce the CO2 by threefold. And that's a very effective measure. And at our event may lead, if we get all the people to do car share or like go into buses, reduce the emissions of the event by half. Now looking at the operations part, this graph shows the total emissions. So it was 85 tons for 2021. And it's again divided in transport and the operations on site. And again, you will see that the transportation of all the stuff that needs to go to the to the location has a huge dimension, has a huge share. And even the persons, like the staff, they almost contribute to the biggest part in terms of the transportation. So also there, carpooling is very important. So transportation makes 62% of the operations. And what we need to focus on is local suppliers. And then the second biggest chunk is the power supply, the transporting of the generators, and also the fuel consumption that creates the emissions. And now looking at the legacy, our event existed from 2002 to 2021 now. 20% around are operations and 80% are transport. And the buses that transport way more people, they don't contribute this biggest share. So cars are the biggest emitter and the topic to tackle, or RVs, or even airplanes. We don't fly because we live fairly close to the event. But if you host an event where people have to fly, this will even become a bigger share. It's probably the biggest challenge in terms of CO2 reduction. So what you can see here is the growing emissions, but it's a bit distorted because also the participants grew. Here in COVID-19, basically that's why we just had a virtual event, so no emissions. But to translate this to a tangible measure, we have one metric to compare it. The 5,000 tons that we created as a legacy is equivalent to 5,000 hot air balloons. On this picture, you can see 50. I counted them for you, and 100 times this amount in terms of volume will be the CO2 that we as a festival have contributed. And that makes it visible what has long been not visible. And it's a sad contribution that we're trying to mitigate. And one way to mitigate this is to bring transparency. And for displaying purposes, or to show you that we walk it like we talk it, we compare MediMeisterschaften to Kiwiburn. Of course, there are limitations, right, in terms of the model, granular data level, but it shows that even with like we travel on average 800 kilometers, I think for Kiwiburn it's a similar distance, but in some ways we perform better, and this is mainly because of ride sharing. And why do we ride share? Because people, it's more cheap, it's cheaper for the students so far. That was the biggest motivation, and the party on the bus so far, right? But it also is very sustainable, and this the dimension we try to tackle in 2022 as the 2022 as the single most important dimension of emissions for our event. And what we hope to inspire you to is to also measure your event and like build a data pool where we can learn from each other and look at the best performing examples. So enhance friendly competition and look at the whole legacy, and also transportation. This is crucial. And now coming to the last part of offset. So what you see in green is the part that we were able to offset. So with only collecting money, raising money this year, we were able to offset 25% of the whole CO2 legacy. We collected 25,000 euros. The donors came from multiple sources. Around 10% of the participants donated. One stage contributed their whole legacy. The main organizers offset their operation emission, and we had a big donor that was giving a big share of the emissions, and the universities offset their bus emissions from 2019. And where did we invest the money? So this is an essential part. We could hold a separate presentation on this. I have put a lot of thought in this topic for the last year, and I wouldn't say I would strongly disagree. It's greenwashing if it's a certified project. And what we are investing in is Amazon preservation in Colombia, where an area 15 times the size of Berlin is being protected through also empowering indigenous people, 14,000 that live in this area. And to compare it to the deforestation of the Amazon, this year it was around I think 13 times the size of Berlin. And if you look at this on a map, I think you would maybe get shivers. I don't know how emotional you are, but it's a devastating huge share that also endangers the wildlife and the biggest carbon sink in South America, etc. I could go on forever, but it's important to protect the Amazon. And afforestation in Germany is another dimension that we also tackled, and clean drinking water in Madagascar. So basically choosing your project is an important step to inspire people. For next year, our biggest message is save fuel or no to fuel, because also of the war reasons and the dependency of Germany and Europe on the oil of Russia. So what we will invest in is a sustainability project that invests in renewable energies or energy supply in Europe to liberate us from the dependencies from Russia, Russian oil. And learnings for this year, we included in the ticket price. So if you allocate 5% of the ticket price, you will have enough money to also offset some of the previous emissions. And find inspiring offset projects is important. So we have finished this big chapter, and let's take a small breather. It's a lot of information we know, but also we like to give all of you a summary of the efforts, so you can get inspired on the dimension you want to tackle with your event or your camp. So let's get it over to power supply.
Okay, thanks, Nils. So yeah, so we're just going back to our 2020 report here. And what we did was we surveyed 46 of our theme camps to get our foundation data. And what we found was that most of those camps were actually generating or had the capacity to generate more power than they were using. And that was basically in a lot of cases because they didn't actually know how to calculate the loading of the power that they were going to be using. And they weren't allowing for fluctuations during the day and the night. They basically took the good old engineer's view of, you know, get 3 times what you need and you never have to worry about it. And so what they found during 2020, once we talked to them, was we're getting theme camps that were talking about collaborating together, sharing generators, and camping as little villages. What we did find, we only had 19 generators, but obviously some of those were large and some were small. We did have the starting of a sprinkling of solar power systems coming in. So we had 9,000 watts for 2020. And for 2021, we had more. I haven't got the figure with me, unfortunately. And for 2022, we were actually going to have a whole village of solar powered ones and a whole avenue of solar powered ones. But unfortunately, we had to cancel because of COVID. So that's now all rolling over to 2023. So as I say, the learnings we got from that is spare capacity. So the first thing is theme camps need to know how to calculate what power they need, and then they can adjust the size, not of generators, but hopefully of solar powered systems to meet their needs. As far as solar is concerned, there's obstacles for some people, obviously cost. In New Zealand, the availability of parts and panels, and also knowledge. Knowledge was a bit of a shortfall. And that's why a lot of the initiatives being taken through Hive, through the RAT group, through the renewables community at Burning Man is all helping us. And we've got a lot of Kiwis who are tapping into those resources now to build up their knowledge base. The other aspect of solar, and it's the same at Burning Man, is if I come along with my solar system for 2 weeks of the year, what am I going to do with it the rest of the time? Do I leave it on site so it feeds into the national grid for the benefit of Burning Man or the benefit of Kiwiburn? Do we move it out to a local community, a primary school or similar thing? In New Zealand, we're fortunate our event is run during the school holidays. So that's one option because they wouldn't have a use for it while we're actually having our event. And of course, the other option is people take it back and hook it up at home and reduce their reliance on fossil fuels. The other aspect for our event, and a lot of people poo-poo the idea, is would it actually be better to make mains power available to some of the camps? So we're fortunate being on a beef farm that there's actually a power supply that comes down the road, which we could tap into. There would be some obviously asset cost up front to do it, but we're going to do an investigation to see which of those has less impact on the environment. So Obviously, generators are the worst, but when it comes to looking at solar power, when you're only wanting it for 2 weeks of the year, as opposed to mains power. And so we've got a group looking at that at the moment.
Hi, this is Frog. I'm sorry I'm late. I'm in Gerlach, so I have difficult connectivity. But this is an example of why it's important to customize and to make individual criteria or goals for each particular regional burn or event. So we're working on BLAST, as we've mentioned probably, and that is an application for the playa. And you can see on the left-hand side, we have several just initial variables that could be the same or could be different in each location around the planet. So for example, as I'm in Gerlach, this is a remote location and we don't have good connectivity. Kiwiburn is similar, but Medi is in a more central location to people. The climate is obviously the biggest difference. The playa is an arid desert. Kiwiburn is a lush paddock, a pasture, a working farm. Medi is on an airport tarmac, so it's not particularly lush like the paddock, but it's much less severe than the dusty playa. So, but all of the events are in summer, so that's a factor from an environment standpoint and from protection. And so you see temperature, precipitation, those are obviously extreme things for the playa. And so in the playa for shelter, our big thing is first of all, shade and sun control, and then dust and protection from the wind and the other elements of the environment. The paddock and Germany are much less severe, and so we don't have to have the same standards or same criteria for each burn. We can customize them. And then of course, when we begin to add dimensions that we have in Burning Man, such as community and culture, those could be all the same, such as the agrarian environments we find ourselves in, or they can be quite unique and exciting, such as the native peoples that we work with both in Nevada and in New Zealand. So that's an illustration of why it's important to have both consistent standards and metrics around the planet, as well as to be able to customize. And that gives us some takeaways and learnings. We need to consider the environmental impact, and also, as we've mentioned before about one-time use versus repeat use. Can you use recycled materials or reimagine them year to year? And then of course, operations and the ability to store materials or equipment or things close by the event and reduce transportation costs and shipping is great. Next one, please. Back to water. I think that's Nils.
Yeah, so look, guys, we almost are halfway done, and these sections are a lot shorter than the initial ones. So can you hear me? Yeah. So I guess yes. So let's talk about water. I was actually kind of shocked when I heard this number from my colleagues. For the 3 days, we use 1.3 million liters of drinking water for sanitary purposes like showers, toilets, for catering, and for drinking water. If you think persons drink like 2 to 3 liters a day, assuming that they would get all of that water from what we provide, there would still be 10 out of 140 liters. So most goes to waste for showering, for catering, and it's actually also a big backpack that we have, like ecological. And this one shows that we haven't calculated this before. It's a shortfalling of our model, and it motivates us from the future to do this in the next years, to benchmark ourselves also in terms of gray water use and water use per participant per year. And what are the learnings? So we want to measure the water use and maybe centralize the water use, because I think some of the principles from Burning Man, the self-reliance, I don't know if it's very efficient that people put weight in their car with water that they eventually drink, or rather having like a central supply of usage. So that would hopefully also raise the awareness and then like improve the gray water treatment disposal, which we were already doing, but to 30%, but I think it can be improved. So that was water. And now we look into food, the next category that you can tackle with your event in terms of sustainability. What you see here is a plate, and that's the planetary health diet. Some of you might have heard about it, some may not. It's the answer of more than 20 scientists, experts in that field, by a commission from Lancet, as far as I know, from one of the most important scientific papers, to come up with a diet that feeds our planet. And I think we will probably end up around 10 to 12 billion people. Population will not eternally increase, but that's a lot of people to feed. So to feed that amount of people that is healthy and sustainable for the planet. And I think the most remarkable part about the planetary health diet is a lot of vegetables, these unsaturated plant oils, plant source protein, whole grains, no few added sugars, but this one, small fraction of dairy foods and animal source protein. So they're not saying be vegetarian or vegan, but reduce this intake because it takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of animal harm, and we will not be able to feed the planet, and we're already not. So 2 billion people on this planet don't have enough food, 2 billion people are overweight, and the rest are more or less in the middle. And if we look at this graph, you don't have to understand the detail, but just the sheer scale. It's talking about the estimated greenhouse gas emissions across all the supply chains for different kind of food sources. So down here you have green stuff, plant-based, and here you have beef. And if I can tell you one thing, how you can make a big contribution, stop eating beef. You can eat, even like, I'm not saying eating pig or other animals, I would say eat no animals in terms of doing no harm. But if you want to cut one thing that really contributes impressively, undisproportionately much to greenhouse gases and the decay of our nature, it's beef production. So at Burning Man, at MediMeisterschaften, at our event, what are we doing? We provide tasty vegetarian and vegan options. So people kind of are drawn to that, they are inspired. And we made food donations and reduce waste. And that's basically the message. So it's important to inspire to this important dietary lifestyle change, which is healthy. I didn't go into the details of like the health benefits of a vegetarian or plant-based diet, but there's a lot of good data on that if you're interested. It protects other living beings. It prevents zoonotic diseases that we see a lot. You remember COVID, and it's more environmentally friendly. I'm not saying COVID came from the livestock, but we have seen other big pandemics, the zoonotic pandemics that came from livestock, such as the SARS or something like that. Okay, so in terms of the structure of this presentation, we have now covered all of these topics, and we're coming to waste. So recycling is very important, and I'm handing over to Andy.
Okay, thanks, Nil. So back to our favorite 2020 study and our surveying of 42 theme camps. So we were quite pleased with the results of this one. What we found was that 98% of the camps were recycling all their waste. And within that, 90% of the camps were actually composting all their food scraps on site and taking it away with them. And within the recycling itself, 88% of the camps were actually separating the 3 waste streams at source. So we were very pleased with that. What we are going to be looking at is the composting, trying to centralize that. What we did find, unfortunately, though, was the same wasn't found in general camping. So the individuals who were camping by themselves, only half of them basically were doing the composting of food scraps, and roughly half of them were doing the recycling and the separating. There was one composting toilet amongst them all, which was pleasing to see. But we obviously need to do a lot of work as far as education and getting them involved, which we have done since then. And so Nils will cover his side of this.
So in terms of reducing waste, I think we are not the benchmark. I'm very inspired and by the leave no trace principle, and we're aiming towards that. So also we have some initiatives, for example, collecting refundable cans, the cigarette butts, and also relying on reusable cups, etc., etc. But what I wanted to show in this context is another times this benchmarking, and this shows basically the waste production from our event from 2014 to 2021. We skipped 2020 because it didn't take place, but you can see a reduction, and it's very it takes a lot of infrastructure to take away all this waste, to collect it, and we were incentivizing the participants, and they're listening, and that's our goal, to really lower this number to have less waste. And I think this gives us as a tangible measure. So we're talking about kilogram per participant. So every participant brings another 4 kilos of waste. And if we now sum up these kind of numbers, we have around 140 liters of wastewater. We have 50 or more kilos of CO2 and 4 kilos of waste. So there's a lot we bring to the events, and we hope through kind of measuring this, we make people aware about it. And as a learning, we just aim for centralized composting, like these composting toilets. We have had them on our event as well. They're actually scaling very much in Europe and across the world, as you have heard from Andy. And just improved recycling collection, give the people really the opportunity to do the right thing, and incentivize as well to not bring so much. So for example, plastic bottles, drink the fresh drinking water we provide on site, and don't bring your own bottles, because in terms of transport, in terms of plastic and in sustainability, it's just inefficient. So we're coming to the conclusion already. Andy.
Okay. So again, just going back to our 2020 report, and what we found was that there were various things that were highlighting to us through the data that we had, in terms of things like the recycling, the abundance of power, and the main thing, as I mentioned, was the need for educational programs. One of the key things we came across, of course, was the good old principle of self-reliance and the conflict that people had with that as far as some of the sustainability efforts that we were trying to put in place. And to be honest, it came from a lot of the old diehards who think that self-reliance is the be-all and end-all, and you've got to go into the desert and be self-reliant completely. But we don't believe in that. We believe that you've got to look at the impact on the environment, and there's compromise to be had, because quite often self-reliance, sorry, if we can just go back one, because you can have quite a lot of impact on the environment. So you've got duplication of goods and structures and things going in there. If people are carrying their own water, there's a big tendency to bring in plastic bottled water. Obviously, the transportation becomes inefficient, and we mentioned before the unused spare power. And you know, the standard use of generators and things like that versus main grid, all of those things have a negative impact. Whereas if we can start looking at collaborations, you know, we can get somewhere. We also have a civic duty, and that's one of our principles as well, to protect our people, our community, our environment, and our planet. And so the civic duty and the protection of the planet upsets self-reliance as far as we're concerned at Kiwiburn. So what we're going to look at doing is basically trying to take things beyond self-reliance of an individual. We're saying you look at an individual level. The next step is you look at your camp, and your camp should be self-reliant. So that's a group of individuals working together. And then the camps become villages, or as we've now got with Burning Man hubs and neighborhoods. So they in turn become self-reliant, but again, not at the expense of the environment. And then as an overall event, we have to be self-reliant. So we're taking it beyond that. And so what we've come up with is we're saying that self-reliance means a collaboration at whatever level generates the most beneficial outcome for our people and our planet. So nobody has to lug 80 kilos of camping gear and water in isolation onto the site anymore. The key thing above all this that we have found is that if we're going to get anywhere, sustainability has to be fun and rewarding. It's not a finger pointing exercise or anything like that. It's a matter of getting people together, sharing ideas. It can't be an onerous duty. And one thing we haven't mentioned in our talk so far is, I mentioned right at the start, a group of us called the Green Kiwis. And that was a group of young people that Tim and I got together, and they've worked religiously for the last 8 or 9 months preparing for Kiwiburn 2022 that unfortunately didn't go ahead. But the one thing that drove it was having fun and making connections with people. And we had 100 theme camps, and of those 100 theme camps, we had 100 sustainability leads. And our weekly online brainstorming sessions, we'd have numbers of up to 60 or 70 individuals joining in. And so that was the key, getting the community involved. And obviously one of the key things we can do is we can recycle timber into art. And I'm sure everybody agrees with that sentiment. So over to you, Tim.
Hello.
Mark, are you there? Yeah, we hear you.
Can you hear me? Yes. So to continue Andy's thought and also to address this potential conflict that we hear about self-reliance. So one of the important things to recognize is that we have 10 principles or more, depending on how your approach is. But for all of these different principles, gifting is the most important when it comes to the environment and to green our world. And the thing about gifting is that it's an expression and an exchange of love. And so there's several gifts here, and gifts are reciprocated. So Mother Earth has given her love to us. She's given herself. Now she needs us, and it's time. So everybody, let's love our mothers. Give your gifts. Thank you. If you would like to participate, we're going to try to expand this and grow this and share our knowledge and share our ideas around the planet, as well as customize and meet your individual needs in your particular geography and culture. So if you're interested, please send me an email. We'll get you into the team. It's obviously a long process, but it's, as I've said, and we would love to have you participate with us. Thank you. Well, I don't know if no questions is good or bad, or you just can't hear me.
I'll start with a question. I'd like to know more about the composting toilets.
Could you state your name and your location, please?
Hello, I'm Marco. I'm Seattle, RC.
Thank you. Andy, do you want to answer waste?
Yep, I can do that. So what actually happened is we've been talking about composting toilets for some time, and then COVID came along, and unbeknownst to us, COVID had a side effect on portaloos. So over in New Zealand, certainly, portaloos became as rare as hen's teeth. And basically 3 months before our event was started and we did our usual yearly thing of booking our portaloos in, we got told we haven't got any for you, which threw us into panic mode, because obviously without sanitation, you can't have an event. So that became another incentive for us to look at composting toilets. So what we're doing this year, or we were going to be doing, and we're now doing in 2023, is we're doing a trial of composting toilets. We're on a working beef and sheep farm. So we have the agreement of the owner that we'll actually be doing the composting on site as a trial, with the intention of moving more and more towards that direction if we can. As far as the toilets are concerned, they're just basically the bucket with the sawdust in them, and we'll be clearing those and moving them to a centralized composting location. Was there any particular aspects of it you were interested in, or just a general interest?
It was just a general interest. I often wonder how something like that could be implemented on the scale of Black Rock City, or even just large theme camps at Black Rock City. So thank you.
Maybe I can answer to that. So in Germany, at several big events with 80,000 people, we have implemented this. One essential part is that you divide basically peeing, because all the liquid impairs the composting, and then people basically very quickly pick up the logic of taking a bit of this kind of wood pieces into a cup when they go to the toilet, and then per session they add this to the toilet. And it's quite successful in Germany, and there are some companies who are able to provide up to 300 toilets or more to events.
This is Frog again. Just to wrap up that question, I think what we've seen from a technical standpoint is the separation of the two streams that Nils mentioned. So the uric acid causes one set of reactions that you really want to have different. So it's an interesting challenge, but I'd like to go on to another question. This is a more general question first, which is about creating benchmarks. And so what I'll start off just beginning the benchmarks, but we are in the process of developing the benchmarks. So that's a reason for this call, is to talk about those. What are the best benchmarks? What are metrics we want to measure? And how can we choose the most effective things? So that's an interesting thing, because you asked about scientific viability. And, how precise do we need to be to clean up the environment? One of the challenges in the environmental movement is that we've just not made because about how many tons of CO2. Well, how big is this ton of CO2? Just because we're arguing about the metrics. So do you have any more comments on that? And anybody else chime in about different metrics and your thoughts?
Nils, do you want to go?
Ed, go ahead, Andy.
Yep. So with our metrics, we basically did the surveying by doing a physical survey. So as people came into the gate to collect their tickets and they're queuing in their vehicles, we actually had teams of people approaching every vehicle with their clipboards and their little pieces of paper in those days, and basically just interviewing them. And because we do tend to have lengthy queues and wait sometimes of up to an hour or 2 hours to get onto the site, we actually turned it into entertainment. So even though they were asking questions, they were actually doing it with some comedy and some drama and things like that. So it actually kept the people engaged. But basically, we interviewed everybody coming in. And then from the theme camps, we had a group of people who were going around and interviewing the theme camps. I mean, if you got into the real nitty gritty of it, the mathematics wouldn't be 100%, but it was certainly a good starting point, and we're just developing it each year. And we've now got a whole team of people in our Green Kiwis who are absolute nerds about data and analytics, and they're just going berserk with the opportunities that I've got coming up with our next event.
Yeah, so I can also just add to this that from our side, we focus very much on the transportation model. We had very precise data from the registration processes, and in terms of operation, we had people on site asking for the emissions. And this year, from each university, we will have a representative that will measure their own dimension of sustainability and CO2 emissions. Maybe wrapping up, because I think we have 2 more minutes to go. Are there any other questions?
There was a question about getting people to buses, and they asked if there was a contractor operating a bus. Do you want to clarify that, Ed, if there's anything else about the...
Okay, so maybe closing for all of the people that were in this call and would like to jump out. And we hope there were some takeaways, and now I'm happy to continue, or we as a group, with questions you might have, starting with bus transport. Bus transport usually at our event is organized through the universities. Each university might contribute, and you can see it as like a camp coming to the playa with up to 1,000 participants, or some even have 1,500. And then there are 1 to 2 people that basically organize this bus transportation. I have been doing that for my university many years ago, already, and it's just a matter of like reaching out to them early, because buses might be booked out. What is the specific question about buses? Because I think you just have to align on several things. You need a COVID-19 concept, right? Like what about a person that gets positive? These things need to be figured out before, because these might be some fears that people might have. What is the price for the participants to pay at full load? When does the bus start and departure? How is the check-in at the event site? So there are several dimensions to this, but nothing that can't be resolved. And actually also a lot of things become easier because you don't have a responsibility in driving. One of the risks after like an excessive event.
There's one question in there about how do bus riders get their stuff to the event?
That's an easy one. They just put it in the bus. I mean, basically, there are participants and there are organizers, and the organizers usually need a lot more storage room. So they take these small camper vans and or like vans where they put in the stuff. They also arrive a few days earlier, probably similar to the camps. And but the participants, there is a quite relevant share that you can bring, like let's say 2 backpacks easily. Or 2 bags to bring to the event.
And I think the other part of that is that you need to think about transport in 2 separate streams. This is from the perspective of a camp, a theme camp. So you have the people and you have your stuff. So just as you would, for example, try to figure out sharing your food and consolidating the water so that you're transporting less weight. You can do the same thing with all of the aspects of your stuff. And that includes your structures, your tents, your equipment, your tables, your chairs, everything that you would bring out to an event. And then of course, as burners, we're bringing art and all sorts of crazy and funky stuff. So consolidating your stuff is an equally important thing to make sure people have enough resources with them, as well as to reduce the overall cost and weight. So maybe that really is a thing to wrap up in the last 10 minutes and conclude, because as we've had our starts and stops with COVID around the planet, we've seen an overall common thread that carpooling and bus transportation are huge priorities. So that's our big goal for the year, and we would love to hear feedback about that. I think the other thing that I am most concerned about is that we just can't say buses are for everybody. We need to make sure we're thinking about ride and affordability. So the environment is important, but we have to be inclusive and have everybody participate. So I'll turn it back out to the questions about buses.
Just a very short comment. We're not talking about buses. We're talking about efficient transportation. That can also mean more carpooling. Whatever is in your kind of in your range of freedom to address this issue, right? Maybe that's something I want to make clear. And as well, based on the model that we created, we identified this issue. So we're still also in the process of learning how to best tackle this. So I would be very inspired by people that have good solutions to address this issue, but I'm pretty confident that we can get a lot of people, at least for our event, back on the buses, since we had it in the past.